You stand in a place that exists only in imagination now, but once it was as real as the ground beneath your feet. This is China before the age of printing. An empire that spanned thousands of miles and lasted thousands of years, built not on stone monuments alone, but on something far more fragile. The written word preserved character by character, scroll by scroll, through the patient labor of human hands. Tonight we will journey together through this world of scribes and scholars, of imperial archives and monastery scriptoria, of examination halls where futures were decided by the elegant formation of brushstrokes, of workshops where paper itself was born from mulberry bark and mountain streams. We will walk through capitals that have vanished, hold books that have turned to dust, and meet people whose names are recorded in histories they themselves copied by hand. This is a story about memory and forgetting, about the tremendous effort required to preserve knowledge before machines could do it for us, about an entire civilization that depended on the steady hands and sharp minds of men who devoted their lives to the multiplication of texts. Before we begin, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Release the glow of screens, the hum of machinery, the rush of constant information. Imagine instead a world where a book was a rare and precious thing, where the act of reading was a privilege, where knowledge traveled slowly along rivers and roads, carried in leather satchels on the backs of scholars and merchants. Settle in now. Breathe deeply. Let us travel backward through time, to a place where every word mattered because every word was made by hand. The landscape of ancient China is vast beyond comprehension. If you could stand on the northern plains in winter, you would see a flat expanse stretching to the horizon, broken only by the dark line of the Yellow River winding through the pale earth. The wind here is harsh and dry, carrying dust from the Gobi Desert, turning the sky a strange yellowish white. In summer, the same plains turn green with millet and wheat, and the air grows heavy with heat and moisture. This is the heartland of Chinese civilization, the place where farming communities first settled 7,000 years ago, building villages of packed earth, learning to work bronze and then iron, creating the first characters by pressing symbols into wet clay and carving them into oracle bones. Travel south and the landscape transforms. The Yangtze River Valley is a world of water and green, of rice paddies that shimmer like mirrors, of hills shrouded in perpetual mist. Here the air is humid even in winter, and paper must be kept in sealed boxes to prevent mold from blooming across the characters like dark flowers. The cities here are built on different principles than those of the north: lighter wood construction, courtyards open to the rain, roofs that curve upward at the corners to shed water quickly. The dialects spoken here are musical and strange to northern ears, and the food tastes of fish and river plants rather than wheat and mutton. Further south still, beyond the Yangtze, the mountains rise into regions that the imperial government barely controls. Minority peoples live here in villages perched on hillsides, speaking languages unrelated to Chinese, worshipping spirits of the forest and water. And yet even here, in these remote places, Chinese characters slowly penetrate. Traders bring documents written in the official script. Local rulers adopt Chinese administrative practices to legitimize their authority. The written word, like water, finds its way into every corner of the empire. To the west, beyond the fertile river valleys, stretches the Silk Road. Not a single road, but a network of caravan routes crossing some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Here in the desert oases, Chinese culture meets the cultures of Central Asia, India, and eventually Persia and Rome. Buddhist monks travel these routes carrying sacred texts, stopping at oasis towns where they might spend years translating Sanskrit into Chinese, character by painstaking character. The great capitals of these trade routes, Dunhuang, Turfan, Khotan, become repositories of manuscripts in multiple languages, multilingual archives buried by desert sand and preserved by the dry air for over 1,000 years, until modern archaeologists rediscover them, a gift from the past. In these varied landscapes, knowledge must be preserved and transmitted across vast distances. An imperial decree issued in Chang'an must reach administrators in Guangzhou, nearly 1,500 miles to the south. A new commentary on the Confucian classics, written by a scholar in the capital, must be copied and distributed to provincial schools throughout the empire. Medical knowledge accumulated over centuries must be compiled into texts that doctors can study and reference. Astronomical observations must be recorded and compared across decades to refine the calendar. Poetry written by a lonely official in exile must somehow make its way back to the circles of friends who will appreciate it. All of this depends on writing, on the preservation of texts, on the slow multiplication of documents through human labor. The great capitals of ancient China housed libraries of staggering size. In Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty, the imperial library was said to contain over 600,000 scrolls. Imagine a complex of wooden buildings, their roofs tiled in dark gray, arranged around courtyards planted with pine trees.
Inside these buildings,
the walls are lined with wooden shelves, and on the shelves rest the scrolls, each wrapped in silk cloth and labeled with a wooden tag. The scrolls are organized by category: the 5 classics of Confucianism, histories of previous dynasties, philosophical texts, poetry collections, technical treatises on agriculture, medicine, mathematics, astronomy. Some scrolls are ancient, their paper yellowed and brittle, repaired with silk patches where the material has torn. Others are new copies, the ink still dark and fresh, the paper still faintly fragrant with the smell of its making. The librarians who maintain these collections are scholars themselves, men who have passed the imperial examinations and been assigned to this quiet but crucial work. They spend their days inspecting scrolls for damage, making lists of texts that need to be recopied, compiling bibliographies and catalogues. When a scroll is too damaged to repair, they oversee the copying of a new version, comparing the new text character by character with the old to ensure no errors have crept in. They also receive new texts brought to the capital by travelers, examine them for quality and authenticity, and decide which deserve a place in the imperial collection. The physical experience of these libraries is one of hushed reverence. The light filtering through paper windows is soft and even, perfect for reading without glare. The floors are of polished wood that creaks faintly underfoot. In winter, braziers burn charcoal to keep the air dry and prevent mold, but they must be carefully tended to avoid any risk of fire, the greatest terror of any library. The smell is distinctive. Aged paper has a sweet, slightly musty scent, like dried grass. Silk carries a faint animal smell from the worms that produced it. Ink adds a note of carbon and glue. Scholars who work here for years come to love these smells, to associate them with learning and peace, with escape from the political intrigues of the court into a realm of pure knowledge. But these great imperial libraries are fragile institutions. When dynasties fall, libraries burn. The first emperor of Qin, seeking to consolidate his power, ordered the burning of books and the burying alive of scholars. Countless texts were lost in those fires, and we know of them only through later references and fragments. When Chang'an was sacked by rebels at the end of the Han Dynasty, the imperial library was destroyed, its scrolls scattered or used as fuel by soldiers who cared nothing for classical learning. Each time this happens, scholars later attempt to reconstruct what was lost, gathering scattered copies, comparing versions, filling in gaps from memory and inference. The history of Chinese literature is not a simple accumulation, but a cycle of loss and recovery, preservation and destruction. In the provinces, far from the capital, knowledge is preserved in different ways. Wealthy families maintain private libraries, sometimes containing thousands of scrolls, carefully guarded and passed down through generations. A family's library is a source of pride and a practical resource. Sons study these texts to prepare for the examinations, and the family gains prestige by lending rare books to other scholars. Monasteries also accumulate libraries, particularly Buddhist monasteries which receive donations of sutras copied by pious laypeople seeking merit. In these monastery libraries, the texts are often stored in special rotating cabinets, octagonal wooden structures that can be spun to access different sections, inscribed with prayers and decorated with images of guardian deities. The landscape of knowledge in ancient China is thus not a single repository, but a distributed network, fragile and resilient at once, constantly being destroyed and rebuilt, with texts flowing along rivers and roads, copied and recopied, preserved against terrible odds by people who believed that the written word was worth any sacrifice. Before there was paper, there was bamboo. Imagine the weight of knowledge when the material itself is wood. Bamboo grows throughout southern China, tall green stalks that sway in the wind and make a sound like rain when their leaves rustle together. To make writing material from bamboo, you must cut the stalks in autumn when the sap has withdrawn and the wood is at its driest and hardest. The stalks are then split into long narrow strips, each about the width of 2 fingers. These strips must be carefully smoothed, first with a blade to remove the outer skin and any rough spots, then sometimes held over fire to drive out remaining moisture and prevent insect damage. The prepared bamboo strips are laid flat, and the writing begins. Instead of ink and brush, early scribes used sharp knives to carve characters into the surface of the bamboo. Later, as ink technology improved, they would write with brushes, the ink soaking slightly into the wood grain. Each strip could hold perhaps 20 or 30 characters written vertically. When you had filled enough strips to contain a complete text, perhaps dozens, perhaps hundreds, you would lay them side by side in order and bind them together with leather cord or silk thread, passing the binding through small holes drilled at the top and bottom of each strip. Hold a bamboo book in your hands and you feel its weight immediately. Even a short text might weigh several pounds. A complete copy of the Analects of Confucius, a relatively brief text, would require several dozen strips and would be heavy enough that you could not comfortably hold it in one hand for long. Longer texts, the Spring and Autumn Annals, the Book of Changes, became cumbersome bundles that had to be stored in special boxes or cabinets. There are records of dedicated scholars whose leather binding cords wore through from constant use, so often did they unroll and re-roll their bamboo books. The physical nature of bamboo shaped how texts were written and organized. Because each strip held limited characters, texts were composed in terse, economical language with minimal grammatical markers. Classical Chinese developed as extremely compact written language, where a few characters could convey ideas that might require many more words in spoken language. The binding also influenced structure. Texts were organized into sections that corresponded to convenient bundle sizes, and moving between distant sections of a long text required physically separating the bundles. Working with bamboo was laborious. Imagine a government scribe tasked with making 10 copies of a new law to be sent to 10 different provinces. He must carve or write each character hundreds of times across hundreds of bamboo strips, then carefully organize them into bundles, making sure no strips are misplaced or misordered. A single mistake, one strip placed wrongly in the sequence, could render a text incomprehensible or even dangerous if it was a legal code. The work demands absolute focus and accuracy, yet it must often be completed quickly when the emperor issues urgent decrees. Then came silk. For 2,000 years before the Common Era, Chinese artisans knew the secret of silk production, feeding mulberry leaves to silkworm larvae, allowing them to spin their cocoons, then carefully unwinding the single continuous filament from each cocoon and spinning these together into thread. Silk thread could be woven into fabric of surpassing softness and beauty, and this fabric became one of China's most valuable exports, so precious that the trade routes carrying it westward became known as the Silk Road. Silk was also a writing surface. Unlike bamboo, silk could be cut into sheets or left in long rolls, providing continuous space for writing without the awkward binding of separate strips. The texture of silk was smooth under the brush, and ink adhered beautifully to its surface, allowing for elegant calligraphy impossible on bamboo. The fabric could be rolled tightly for storage or transport, making silk manuscripts much more portable than bamboo ones. A long text that might require a heavy bundle of bamboo strips could fit on a single silk scroll that weighed almost nothing. But silk was expensive, fantastically expensive. Only the imperial court, the wealthiest aristocrats, and religious institutions could afford to use silk for writing. Imperial edicts might be written on silk to emphasize their importance and ensure their preservation. Sacred texts were copied onto silk as acts of devotion, the costliness of the material itself serving as an offering to the gods or Buddhas. A Buddhist monastery commissioning a copy of an important sutra on silk might spend as much as a year's income for a middle-ranking official. Working with silk required different skills than working with bamboo. The fabric must be treated to prevent ink from bleeding, often by coating it with a mixture of alum and other substances. The brush technique also differs. Silk requires a lighter touch than bamboo, and the ink must be at exactly the right consistency, not so thin that it spreads uncontrollably, but not so thick that it sits on the surface without penetrating. Master calligraphers developed their touch over decades of practice, learning to produce characters that were both beautiful and legible, that would endure without fading. Yet silk, too, had its vulnerabilities. It attracts insects, moths and silverfish that eat holes through the fabric, destroying characters and eventually rendering texts unreadable. It is sensitive to humidity. In damp conditions, silk grows mold that stains the fabric and eats away at the fibers. It is also highly flammable, and many silk manuscripts were lost to the fires that periodically swept through wooden palaces and libraries. The combination of high cost and physical fragility meant that texts written on silk were often copied onto other materials after a generation or two, and the silk originals were lost. Then, sometime during the Han Dynasty, perhaps around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, came the invention that would transform everything: paper. The traditional story attributes the invention to a court official named Kowloon in the year 105 CE, though archaeological evidence suggests that simple paper may have been made earlier. Regardless of its exact origin, the technique spread throughout China over the following centuries and became the dominant writing material, eventually displacing both bamboo and silk. The process of making paper by hand is labor-intensive, but uses materials that are far more abundant and cheaper than silk. The most common material is the inner bark of the paper mulberry tree, though other plants can be used: hemp, rami. Bamboo itself can be processed into paper. The papermaker begins by stripping the bark from the trees and soaking it in water for several days to soften it. Then comes the beating. The softened bark must be pounded repeatedly with wooden mallets or stone hammers until the fibers separate and turn into a wet pulp. This is exhausting work that can take hours or even days depending on the quantity being processed. The pulp is then mixed with water in a large vat to create a thin suspension. Here the papermaker's skill becomes crucial. Using a rectangular screen made from thin bamboo strips woven together and stretched on a wooden frame, the papermaker dips the screen into the vat and lifts it carefully, allowing water to drain through while a thin layer of fibers settles on the screen's surface. The motion must be smooth and even to produce paper of uniform thickness. Too fast and the fibers don't settle properly. Too slow and the paper becomes too thick and uneven. The wet sheet on the screen is then carefully transferred, couched, onto a piece of felt or cloth. Sheet after sheet is stacked this way, separated by layers of felt. When enough sheets have been made, the entire stack is pressed to squeeze out more water. The pressure must be firm but not so heavy as to damage the fragile wet paper. After pressing, the individual sheets are carefully separated and hung to dry, or sometimes pressed against heated walls to dry them more quickly. The resulting paper, when done well, is surprisingly strong and versatile. It can be thin enough to be nearly transparent or thick enough to have substantial body. It takes ink beautifully, with less tendency to bleed than silk, and it can be rolled, folded, cut, and pasted as needed. Most importantly, it is far cheaper than silk while being lighter and easier to use than bamboo. A sheet of paper might cost 1/100th of what the equivalent area of silk would cost, making it feasible to produce books in quantities that would have been unthinkable before. Paper workshops developed throughout China, often in regions where suitable trees grew abundantly and where mountain streams provided the clean water needed for the process. Some regions became famous for producing particular types of paper. Paper from Shaanxi in modern Anhui province was considered the finest for calligraphy and painting, smooth and white with just the right amount of absorbency. Paper made in Sichuan was known for its strength and durability, suitable for official documents that needed to endure. Each workshop guarded its particular recipes and techniques as trade secrets, varying the mixture of fibers, the beating time, the additives mixed into the pulp to achieve different textures and qualities. Working in a paper workshop was skilled labor. The master papermaker, who knew the secrets of creating the finest sheets, was a respected craftsman who might train apprentices for years before sharing his full knowledge. The work was also hard on the body. The beating of pulp was exhausting. The constant handling of wet materials in cold weather led to joint problems, and the lime or other chemicals used in processing could damage skin and lungs over time. Yet the work was essential, and workshops could be profitable, supplying the constant demand from government offices, schools, monasteries, and private scholars. The landscape of papermaking became part of the landscape of knowledge. Certain rivers became known for the paper made along their banks. Certain valleys where mulberry trees grew in abundance became centers of production. The material itself carried a sense of place when you held a sheet of Shuan paper and felt its particular texture. You were touching something connected to specific mountains and streams, to the hands of particular craftsmen, to traditions passed down through generations. And so the foundation was laid. Bamboo had made writing possible for the literate elite. Silk had allowed for beautiful and portable manuscripts for the wealthy. But paper, cheap, light, versatile paper, would democratize writing in ways that earlier materials never could. The empire that would run on paper now had the material it needed. What remained was to create the social structures and institutions that would put this material to use, that would train thousands upon thousands of scribes to fill these sheets with characters, that would build a civilization on the multiplication and preservation of texts. Wake before dawn in a monastery, in the mountains west of Luoyang. The air is cold and thin, and your breath makes small clouds in the darkness. You rise from your sleeping mat, wash your face with water from a clay jar, so cold it makes your teeth ache, and make your way through the corridors to the scriptorium. Other monks are already there, shadows in the pre-dawn darkness, lighting oil lamps that cast warm pools of light on the long wooden tables. This is your life now, and has been for 3 years since you took your vows. You are a copying monk, and your primary duty is the multiplication of Buddhist sutras. The abbot has assigned you to work on the Lotus Sutra, one of the most important texts in the Mahayana tradition. Your copy will take months to complete, perhaps a year if you work carefully and without rushing, and when it is finished it will be placed in the monastery library, or perhaps donated to another monastery that lacks this text. Your tools are laid out before you on the table, brushes of varying sizes, from thick ones for large characters to fine-pointed ones for annotations, an inkstone, an inkstick, a small ceramic water dropper, a paper knife for cutting sheets, a smoothing stone for pressing wrinkles from the paper. To your left is your model text, the exemplar you will copy from, held open with small weights. To your right is a stack of blank paper, already cut to the correct size, waiting to be filled. You begin with the ritual of making ink. The inkstick is a small rectangle of hardened soot mixed with glue, decorated perhaps with gold characters or an image of a scholar. You add a few drops of water to the inkstone, a flat piece of slate with a shallow depression, and begin grinding the inkstick in a circular motion. The sound is meditative, a soft scraping that becomes almost rhythmic. You grind slowly, adding water drop by drop, watching the mixture darken from gray to black. The consistency must be perfect, too thin, and the characters will be pale and washed out, too thick, and the ink will not flow properly from the brush. When the ink is ready, you dip your brush and test it on a scrap of paper, writing a single character and examining it critically. The darkness is good, the edges are crisp. You begin your day's work. Copying is an act of complete concentration. You read a phrase from the exemplar, perhaps 6 or 8 characters, and hold them in your mind as your hand writes them. The brush moves with a practiced rhythm. Press down for the beginning of a stroke, pull smoothly along the paper, lift slightly at the end. Each character is a small composition, its parts balanced and proportioned according to principles you have studied for years. The vertical strokes must be truly vertical, the horizontal strokes slightly ascending from left to right, the hooks and dots placed just so. You are not trying to exactly reproduce the calligraphy of your model. That would be impossible and perhaps disrespectful, as each person's hand is unique, but rather to create characters that are clear, correct, and aesthetically pleasing. The work requires your entire body, not just your hand. You sit on a low stool or cushion, back straight, feet flat on the ground. Your left hand holds down the paper or rests on the edge of the table for stability. Your right arm moves from the shoulder, not just the wrist, giving strength and control to each stroke. Over hours of work you feel the strain in your shoulders, the ache in your lower back, the tension in your neck from looking down at the page. After copying for 2 hours, the bell rings for morning prayers. You clean your brush carefully, rinse the inkstone, cover your work with a cloth to protect it from dust, and join the other monks in the Dharma hall. The prayers are chanted in unison, ancient Sanskrit syllables, transliterated into Chinese characters, their meaning less important than the sound and the devotion with which they are offered. After prayers comes the morning meal, rice gruel with pickled vegetables, eaten in silence, and then you return to the scriptorium. The work continues through the day with breaks for meals and prayers. By midday your hand begins to tire, and you must concentrate even more carefully to keep your strokes clean and your characters well formed. This is when mistakes are most likely to happen. If you write an incorrect character, you cannot simply erase it. Paper cannot be erased the way bamboo could be scraped clean. Instead, you must mark the error with a small correction symbol and write the correct character beside or above it. Or if the error is serious enough, discard the sheet entirely and begin again. Each discarded sheet feels like a small failure, a waste of material and time. In the late afternoon, as the light begins to fade, you finish your day's quota, perhaps 20 or 30 characters, if you are working on a text with large formal characters, perhaps 100 or more if you are copying a text in smaller, more cursive script. You clean your tools once more, this time with special care, washing the brushes until the water runs clear and reshaping their points before hanging them to dry. The inkstone is rinsed and dried with a soft cloth. Tomorrow you will begin again with fresh ink and paper. But the work is not mechanical drudgery. There is deep satisfaction in it, a sense of purpose. Each character you write is an act of devotion, a way of internalizing the Buddha's teachings. The texts you copy speak of compassion, impermanence, the nature of suffering and the path to liberation. As you write these words again and again, they enter your mind and heart. You are not simply a copyist but a practitioner, using the physical act of writing as a form of meditation. There is also pride in craftsmanship. When you complete a scroll and step back to examine it, seeing page after page of characters you have written with your own hand, characters that are clear and beautiful and correct, you feel a quiet joy. This scroll will outlive you. It will be read by people you will never meet. It will carry the Dharma forward through time, a physical embodiment of the teaching made possible by your labor. The community of scribes develops its own culture and hierarchies. The senior monks who have been copying for decades are revered for their skill. Their calligraphy is so refined that their work is used as models for younger monks to study. The abbot sometimes commissions them to create special copies on the finest paper with the finest ink, copies that will be presented to important donors or sent to other monasteries as gifts. These master scribes also serve as teachers, correcting the work of novices, demonstrating techniques, offering encouragement when a young monk becomes frustrated with his own progress. There are also professional lay scribes who work in government offices and private workshops. These men, and they're almost always men, as few women receive the education necessary to become scribes, have chosen copying as their livelihood. They are paid by the sheet or by the scroll, and they work quickly, sometimes sacrificing elegance for speed. A government scribe might need to produce 50 copies of a tax notice in a single day, or copy out a legal judgment while officials wait impatiently for the document. The pressure is constant, and there is little room for mistakes. A scribe who makes too many errors, or whose handwriting is unclear, will lose his position and his income. Yet even among these professional scribes, there is pride in the work. A man who can write quickly and accurately, who can produce 500 clean characters in an hour, is valuable and knows it. The best scribes develop reputations and can command higher fees. Some specialize in particular types of documents, legal contracts, medical prescriptions, poetry collections, and become known for their expertise in these areas. A scribe who specializes in copying medical texts, for instance, must not only write clearly, but also understand the technical terminology well enough to catch and correct errors in the exemplar he is copying from. The life of a scribe, whether monastic or secular, is one of quiet discipline. The work shapes your hands. Calluses form on your fingers from holding the brush. Ink stains work deep into the creases of your skin and never quite wash out. It shapes your mind as well, training you in patience and precision, teaching you to value accuracy and clarity. You learn to sit still for hours, to maintain focus even when your body is tired, to find satisfaction in the completion of each small task. In a world before machines, before mass production, before any way to multiply texts except through human labor, the scribe is essential, and the scribe knows it. The sounds of the scriptorium become familiar and comforting. The soft scratch of brushes on paper, the gentle clink of an inkstick against stone, the rustle of pages being turned, the occasional sigh or clearing of a throat, the creak of wooden stools as people shift position. In winter there is the crackle of charcoal in braziers, carefully placed far from any paper to prevent fire. In summer there is the drone of insects beyond the windows and the whisper of wind through the courtyard's bamboo grove. This is your world, your daily reality, the place where knowledge is preserved one character at a time. And at night, When you return to your small cell and lie down to sleep, your hand still remembers the motion of the brush. Your mind still sees characters swimming before your closed eyes. You dream sometimes of words arranging themselves on an infinite scroll, stretching away into darkness, each one perfect and clear. In these dreams you are not tired. Your hand does not ache. You write forever, and the work is never finished, and that is somehow exactly as it should be. In this empire built on the written word, the ability to write well could elevate a poor farmer's son to the highest levels of government. The imperial examination system, refined over centuries, became the primary mechanism for selecting officials, and success in these examinations required not just literacy but mastery of an enormous body of classical texts, the ability to compose poetry and essays in prescribed forms, and the capacity to write with speed and elegance under intense pressure. The examinations were held at multiple levels. The lowest level, the preliminary examination, was conducted at the county level and allowed thousands of candidates to compete. Those who passed became shenjuan, government students entitled to a small stipend and exemption from certain taxes and labor service. This was already an achievement that brought honor to a family, but it was only the first step. The provincial examinations, held every 3 years in the provincial capitals, were far more competitive. Perhaps 1 in 100 candidates would pass and earn the Juran degree, making them eligible for official appointment or to compete in the highest level examination. The metropolitan examination, held in the capital, was the pinnacle. Candidates who had passed the provincial examination would travel from across the empire, sometimes journeying for weeks or months to reach the capital city. They would arrive at the examination compound, a vast complex of small brick cells arranged in long rows. Each cell was barely large enough for one person to sit, perhaps 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, with a small shelf that could serve as a writing desk and a bucket for waste. These cells had no roofs except for the overhanging eaves of the corridor in front, leaving candidates exposed to sun and rain. The examination lasted 3 sessions spread over a week. When the bell rang to signal the start, candidates entered their assigned cells carrying their supplies: brushes, ink, paper, food for the day, water, perhaps a thin blanket against the night cold. The gates were then locked and guards posted. For the next day and night, and often longer, the candidates would remain in their cells, writing without pause, except for brief moments to eat or relieve themselves. The questions were designed to test both knowledge and thinking. Candidates might be asked to write essays, explicating difficult passages from the Confucian classics, the Analects, the Mencius, the Spring and Autumn Annals, the Book of Rites. These were texts they had memorized completely, often in childhood, and had studied in depth for years. But the examiners were not simply looking for rote repetition. They wanted to see original insight, elegant argumentation, the ability to draw connections between different classical texts, and to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary problems. An essay might need to be 2,000 or 3,000 characters long, all of it written from memory without any reference books, all of it in classical Chinese following strict rhetorical conventions. The physical demands were grueling. Writing for hours in a cramped cell with no proper seat, back bent over the small shelf, hand moving constantly. The paper provided by the examiners was of standard quality but not the best. Sometimes the fibers were uneven and the brush would catch, requiring extra care. The ink must be ground fresh, and candidates learned to prepare enough at the start to last through an entire essay so the darkness and consistency remained uniform. To run out of ink in the middle of an essay could be disastrous, and grinding more would cost precious time. Cheating was a constant concern. The temptation was enormous. A single examination could determine the entire course of a life, and the methods were ingenious. Some candidates tried to bring in cheat sheets, tiny papers covered with microscopic characters hidden in the lining of their clothes or written on their undergarments. Some wrote notes on the inside of food containers. Some even hired people to bribe guards or to climb the walls at night and pass notes to candidates inside. The authorities responded with elaborate precautions. All candidates were searched before entering. Their brushes and ink were inspected. Their clothing was examined. Sentences for caught cheaters were severe. Permanent ban from examinations, public humiliation, sometimes physical punishment or exile. But the most effective deterrent against cheating was the examination system's own design. All papers were copied by official scribes before being graded, and the copies used different paper to prevent examiners from recognizing candidates by their distinctive paper or handwriting. Names were sealed. The candidate's name was written on a separate sheet that was folded and pasted over the name on the examination paper, not to be opened until after grading was complete. This prevented favoritism based on family connections or bribery. The system was not perfect, but it represented a genuine attempt to create advancement based on merit rather than solely on birth or wealth. The psychological pressure was immense. Young men studied for years, sometimes decades, attempting the examinations again and again. There are records of candidates in their 50s and 60s still trying to pass, their hair white, their hands shaking from age, but their determination undiminished. The night before an examination, the hostel rooms where candidates stayed would be filled with the sound of men reciting passages aloud, testing their memory, trying to calm their nerves. Some would pray at temples, offering incense to the god of literature. Some would drink wine to steady themselves, though too much could be disastrous the next day. During the examination itself, the compound became a strange city of silence and concentration. Thousands of men in their individual cells, all writing furiously. The only sounds the scratch of brushes on paper and the occasional cough or groan. Guards walked the corridors, watching for any sign of irregularity. Examiners sat in comfortable rooms reviewing early submissions, reading through essays with critical eyes, making notes in the margins. The quality of writing they were looking for was extremely high. Not merely correct but elegant, demonstrating wide learning, original thought and beautiful calligraphy. When the final bell rang and the examination ended, candidates would emerge from their cells exhausted, many of them having not slept for 36 hours or more. Their hands would be cramped and ink-stained. Their minds would be foggy with fatigue. They would submit their papers and leave, and then begin the agonizing wait for results. The papers would be graded over the following weeks, and eventually the names of successful candidates would be posted publicly. To see your name on that list was to feel your entire life change in an instant. To not see it was crushing disappointment, but for many not the end. They would return home, resume their studies and try again in 3 years. Those who passed the highest examination and earned the Jinshi degree, the presented scholar, were received by the emperor himself in a special ceremony. They were now members of the empire's elite, eligible for appointment to high office, their names recorded in the official histories. Their families gained immense prestige. Even those who passed only the lower levels gained status and opportunities. The examination system created a meritocratic element within what was otherwise a highly hierarchical society. It meant that talent and dedication could, at least in theory, be rewarded regardless of one's origins. But the system also had its costs. The curriculum was extremely narrow, focused almost entirely on the Confucian classics, to the exclusion of practical learning in mathematics, agriculture, engineering, or military affairs. The emphasis on memorization and formulaic essay writing could stifle creativity. Many brilliant minds spent their entire lives mastering texts written 1,000 years earlier rather than investigating the natural world or developing new ideas. The psychological toll of repeated failure drove some men to despair, even suicide. Families sometimes bankrupted themselves supporting a son through years of study, only to see him fail again and again. Yet for all its flaws, the system worked in one crucial sense. It created a bureaucratic elite that was highly literate, culturally unified, and trained in a common set of texts and values. An official appointed to a distant province could communicate with his colleagues using references to the classics they had all memorized. The shared culture of the examination system provided a kind of glue that held together an enormous and diverse empire, and it ensured that the empire remained, above all, an empire of the written word where power flowed to those who could master texts and wield the brush with skill. Buddhism entered China from India along the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty, and with it came a vast new literature. The Buddhist canon, the Tripitaka, or Three Baskets, consisted of thousands of texts, the sutras recording the Buddha's teachings, the Vinaya outlining monastic discipline, and the Abhidharma containing philosophical and psychological analysis. These texts existed in various Indian languages, particularly Sanskrit and Pali, and they needed to be translated into Chinese for the Dharma to take root in Chinese soil. The translation projects were staggering in scope and complexity. A single sutra might be dozens or even hundreds of pages long, filled with technical terminology, philosophical concepts, and narrative structures foreign to Chinese literary tradition. How do you translate the word nirvana when no equivalent exists in Chinese? How do you render metaphysical concepts about the nature of consciousness that are based on Indian philosophical frameworks completely different from Chinese thought? The great translation bureaus in the capital cities brought together teams of monks, some from India and Central Asia, who understood the original languages, others who were Chinese masters of literary style. They would work collaboratively, sometimes for years, on a single text. An Indian monk would read a passage aloud, perhaps first translating it mentally into Chinese, then discussing its meaning with the Chinese monks. They would debate possible translations of key terms, consulting dictionaries, comparing the usage of words in different contexts, sometimes creating entirely new compound words to express ideas that had no Chinese precedent. Consider the word Buddha itself. Should it be translated or transliterated? The team chose transliteration, for in Chinese, because translating it as awakened one or enlightened one would lose the specific technical meaning and the connection to the historical Buddha. But other terms were translated. Dharma became Fa, meaning law or teaching. Sangha became Seng, the monastic community. The translators created a whole new vocabulary, enriching the Chinese language with concepts drawn from Indian Buddhism. The physical process of translation and copying created enormous demand for scribes. When a translation was complete, it needed to be copied so that it could be distributed to monasteries throughout China. A monastery commissioning a copy of the entire Lotus Sutra might employ a team of scribes working for months. Wealthy donors would sponsor such copying projects as acts of merit, and the most elaborate copies would be written in gold or silver ink on blue or purple paper, creating manuscripts of stunning visual beauty. Monastic libraries accumulated vast collections of Buddhist texts. The great monasteries might house tens of thousands of scrolls, creating specialized archive buildings with sophisticated climate control, windows positioned to catch breezes but avoid direct sunlight, tile roofs with wide eaves to protect against rain, carefully managed humidity using charcoal and lime to prevent mold. The librarian monks developed classification systems to organize this literature, creating catalogs that listed texts by category, by translator, by date, by the level of Buddhist practice they addressed. Some monasteries specialized in particular texts or traditions. Mount Wutai in Shaanxi became associated with the Avatamsaka Sutra, a massive text describing the infinite interpenetration of all phenomena. Pilgrims would travel there specifically to hear lectures on this sutra or to commission copies. Other monasteries were known for their collections of tantric texts or for their Pure Land Sutras or for their meditation manuals. This specialization created networks of knowledge, with monks traveling between monasteries to study specific texts not available in their home institutions. The practice of sutra copying became a devotional act in itself. Lay Buddhists who could write would copy sutras as a way of generating merit for themselves and their ancestors. The act of writing the Buddha's words was seen as almost equivalent to hearing the Buddha speak, a way of internalizing the teaching through the physical engagement of hand, eye, and mind. Some devotees would copy sutras in their own blood mixed with ink, an extreme form of offering demonstrating complete dedication. Others would copy a single character hundreds of times as a form of focused meditation. The aesthetics of Buddhist manuscripts developed their own distinctive features. Frontispieces illustrated scenes from the sutras, the Buddha preaching on Vulture Peak, or descending from the Tushita heaven, or turning the wheel of Dharma. The paper might be dyed yellow or blue. The text columns were carefully ruled to ensure straight lines and even spacing. Specialized scribes developed hands specifically for sutra copying, characters that were clear and legible while also possessing a flowing, meditative quality that reflected the sacred nature of the content. One of the most significant translation projects was undertaken by the monk Xuanzang in the 7th century. Unsatisfied with the existing translations of key texts, Xuanzang embarked on a dangerous 16-year journey to India to obtain original Sanskrit manuscripts. When he returned to Chang'an with hundreds of texts loaded onto horses, the emperor sponsored a massive translation bureau for him. Xuanzang would spend the remaining 19 years of his life directing the translation of over 70 texts, producing some of the most accurate and elegant Chinese renderings of Sanskrit Buddhist literature. The translation teams worked in large halls provided by the imperial court. Xuanzang would sit at the center, the Sanskrit manuscript before him. Around him sat his team of assistant monks, each with specific expertise, some skilled in Sanskrit grammar, others in Chinese literary composition, others specializing in particular philosophical concepts. Xuanzang would read a passage, explain its meaning, discuss ambiguities and possible interpretations. The team would debate and refine the translation. A scribe would write down the agreed-upon version. Another monk would proofread it. The process was painstakingly slow but produced translations that remain authoritative today. These translations transformed Chinese culture. Buddhist ideas about karma, rebirth, compassion, and emptiness became part of the Chinese intellectual landscape. Buddhist imagery and metaphors entered Chinese poetry and art. The architectural landscape changed as Buddhist temples and pagodas spread across China, each temple housing its library of sutras. The sound of monks chanting in Sanskrit-derived Chinese filled the air in cities and mountain retreats alike. The transmission of Buddhism into China was thus fundamentally a story about translation and textual preservation, about the immense labor of rendering complex ideas from one language into another, about the dedication of monks who spent their lives copying sacred texts, about the wealthy donors who funded these projects, and about the creation of institutional infrastructure to preserve and transmit this growing body of literature. The Dharma traveled on paper and silk, multiplied by ink and brush, preserved by devoted hands working in scriptoria from the great capitals to the remotest mountain monasteries. Every dynasty maintained an official history bureau, and the historians who worked there were tasked with one of the most important and politically sensitive jobs in the empire. They recorded the deeds of emperors and officials, the outcomes of wars and natural disasters, the rise and fall of factions, the decisions made in council meetings. These records would become the official history of the dynasty, and in Chinese thought, this history had tremendous power. It was how later generations would judge the present, how the cosmic mandate of heaven would be seen as granted or withdrawn. The position of court historian was both privileged and dangerous. Historians had unprecedented access to official documents, to council meetings, to the private actions of the emperor. They were expected to record truthfully without fear or favor, to create a historical record that would accurately represent events for posterity. But of course, powerful people did not always want their actions recorded truthfully. An emperor who made a disastrous decision might pressure historians to record it differently. A corrupt official might try to bribe or intimidate the historians to omit certain facts. The ideal was expressed in famous stories of historians who died rather than falsify records. During the Chengqi period, the court historian of the state of Qi recorded that Qi Bezu murdered his lord. Qi Bezu, the powerful minister who had indeed committed this murder, was furious and had the historian executed. The historian's brother immediately took up the post and recorded the same words. He too was executed. A third brother succeeded him and recorded the same words. Faced with this unyielding insistence on truth, Qi Bezu finally relented and allowed the record to stand. The story, whether entirely historical or somewhat legendary, expressed the ideal the historian's duty to truth was sacred, worth dying for. The physical work of maintaining the imperial archives was enormous. Every day, memorials and reports arrived from officials throughout the empire. These had to be catalogued, stored, and made accessible for future reference. The documents came on scrolls of various sizes and qualities of paper. Some were routine administrative reports that needed to be stored but would rarely be consulted. Others were important edicts or policy decisions that would be referenced constantly. The archivists developed sophisticated filing systems using categories and subcategories, date ranges, geographical regions, and subject matter. The archive buildings were constructed with great care. They needed to protect their contents from the primary threats: fire, water, insects, and theft. The buildings were made of stone or brick rather than wood to reduce fire risk. They were raised on stone foundations to prevent flooding. The windows were small and positioned high to avoid direct sunlight while still providing ventilation. Inside, the scrolls were stored in special cabinets made of wood that had been treated with preservatives to repel insects. Each cabinet was labeled with its contents, and detailed catalogues told the archivists exactly where each document could be found. But preservation was not merely a matter of proper storage. Paper and silk degraded over time, and important documents needed to be periodically recopied to prevent their loss. This created a continuous demand for skilled copyists, A team of scribes might be assigned to recopy the entire set of official documents from the previous dynasty, a project that could take years. They would work carefully, comparing their new copies character by character with the originals to ensure no errors crept in. The old copies, now superseded, would be carefully stored as backup or sometimes ritually burned if they were too damaged to preserve. The compilation of each dynasty's official history was a major undertaking that often required decades. It typically began only after a dynasty had fallen and a new one taken its place. This temporal distance was important. It allowed historians to write without fear of offending the current emperor, and it provided the perspective needed to assess the long-term significance of events. The historians would gather all the official documents from the previous dynasty, read through thousands of scrolls of records, interview surviving officials who had served in important positions, and consult private histories and memoirs written by participants in events. The structure of the official histories followed a standard format that had been developed over centuries. They typically included basic annals organized by year, biographical sections on important officials arranged by category, treatises on specific topics like military organization, ritual practices, or economic policy, and tables presenting statistical information. Writing these histories required not just literacy, but analytical ability, judgment about what was significant, and the ability to organize vast amounts of information into coherent narratives. The historians worked in special bureaus provided by the new dynasty, given stipends and exemption from other duties so they could focus entirely on this work. They had access to the captured archives of the previous dynasty, which the victorious forces had carefully preserved specifically for this purpose. The physical labor of reading through these documents was substantial. A historian might spend months just reading through the daily records of court activities for a single emperor's reign, taking notes, identifying patterns, deciding what needed to be included in the final history. The writing itself required careful judgment. How much detail to include? Which of several contradictory accounts to trust? How to present events fairly while also making clear moral judgments. For in the Chinese historical tradition, history was fundamentally didactic, meant to teach moral lessons to future rulers and officials. The historians might spend weeks debating how to characterize a particular emperor's reign, what language to use in describing controversial policies, whether an official who met a tragic end was a loyal martyr or a reckless fool. When sections of the history were drafted, they were read and critiqued by other scholars. Multiple versions might be written and revised. Citations had to be checked. The result was a massive work, often running to hundreds of scrolls, representing the collective effort of multiple historians over many years. When finally completed, copies were made and distributed to official libraries throughout the empire. The work became the authoritative account of that dynasty's history, the foundation for all future understanding of that period. But the archives preserved more than just political history. They also contained detailed administrative records that reveal the everyday functioning of the empire. Tax registers recorded the population and agricultural output of each district. Legal judgments documented actual cases and how laws were applied. Official correspondence between the capital and provincial administrators revealed the challenges of governing distant regions. Engineering records described the construction of dikes, canals, roads, and city walls. Astronomical observations compiled over decades allowed officials to refine the calendar. Medical case histories contributed to the development of medical knowledge. These practical records were less glamorous than the grand histories, but they were essential to governance. An official assigned to manage flood control on the Yellow River would consult the archives to see what strategies had been tried in previous floods, which had worked and which had failed. An official dealing with a famine would look up previous famines to see how relief was organized. The accumulated wisdom of centuries was available to any official who took the time to research it. The archives thus served multiple functions simultaneously. They were repositories of official memory, allowing the state to maintain continuity, despite changes in personnel and dynasties. They were tools of governance, providing information needed for practical administration. They were materials for moral instruction, preserving examples of good and bad rule for future generations to study. And they were monuments to the fundamental Chinese belief that proper order depended on accurate record keeping, that a state that did not remember its past could not successfully manage its present or plan its future. The work of the archivists and historians was quiet and scholarly, far from the excitement of military campaigns or court intrigue. yet they understood themselves as engaged in work of profound importance. They were the guardians of truth, the preservers of memory, the voices that would speak from the present to all future generations. In a culture that venerated the past and believed that wisdom came from studying historical precedent, their role was sacred. Beyond the official world of government documents and classical studies, there flourished a rich tradition of personal literature. Educated men, and occasionally women, though they had far fewer opportunities, wrote poetry, composed essays, kept journals, and corresponded with friends through elaborately crafted letters. This private literary culture was in many ways as important as the official one, providing emotional and intellectual space that the rigid formalities of official life did not allow. Poetry held a special place. From the early folk songs collected in the Book of Songs through the regulated verse of the Tang dynasty and beyond, poetry was the preferred medium for expressing personal feeling, for responding to nature, for exploring friendship and loss and the passage of time. A well-educated man was expected to be able to compose poetry extemporaneously at social gatherings, to respond to the poems of friends with poems of his own that matched their rhyme scheme and meter, to write poems as gifts or consolations or celebrations. The forms were highly structured. Regulated verse, the jintishi, required exactly 8 lines in 5 or 7 characters per line, with strict tonal patterns that created a musical quality when read aloud. Each line needed internal parallelism, and the whole poem needed thematic unity. Within these strict formal constraints, poets expressed an astonishing range of emotion and observation. A poem might capture the exact quality of light on a mountain at dawn, or the loneliness of a traveler in an inn far from home, or the joy of friendship and wine, or grief at the death of a parent, all in just 40 or 56 characters. Writing poetry was both a social activity and a private discipline. Friends would gather for poetry parties, especially in spring when the plum blossoms bloomed, or in autumn when the moon was full. They would drink wine, admire the natural beauty around them, and compose poems, sometimes competitively, sometimes collaboratively. The poems would be written on scrolls and passed around for everyone to read and appreciate. Later, someone might compile the best poems from the evening into a small collection as a memento. But poetry was also deeply personal. A scholar official sent into exile far from the capital might write poems to process his loneliness and disappointment. A son mourning his father might compose poems that would never be shared with anyone, private expressions of grief. An old man looking back on his life might write poems reflecting on what he had achieved and failed to achieve, on memories of youth, on the approach of death. These private poems might be kept in personal journals or shared only with intimate friends. The act of writing poetry was connected to the act of writing itself, to calligraphy. A poem was not just words, but also a visual object. The poet would write it out in his best hand, attending to the aesthetics of the characters on the page, the spacing, the rhythm of thick and thin strokes. A beautifully written poem was a work of art independent of its verbal content. Friends would treasure scrolls containing poems written in the hand of loved ones, keeping them as both literary and visual mementos. Certain poets became famous enough that their work was widely copied and circulated. Li Bai and Du Fu of the Tang dynasty, Su Shi of the Song dynasty. These men's poems were memorized by students, copied into anthologies, used as models for aspiring poets to imitate. But fame was not the goal for most poets. They wrote for the pleasure of the act itself, for the discipline of capturing experience in precise, beautiful language, for the connection it created with friends who understood and appreciated their work. Essay writing was another important form. Unlike poetry, essays could be longer and more discursive, developing an argument or exploring a topic at length. Some essays were personal, reflecting on the writer's own experiences or philosophies. Others were critical, offering new interpretations of classical texts or challenging conventional ideas. Still others were descriptive, capturing a place or an event in vivid prose. The essay tradition valued elegance and illusion. A good essay would reference classical texts and earlier writers, creating layers of meaning through indirect reference. It would balance formal and informal language, shifting registers to achieve particular effects. The best essays were prized for their style as much as their content. The way the sentences flowed, the choice of particular characters, the rhythmic patterns created by alternating sentence lengths. Letter writing was an art form in itself. Letters between friends were not mere utilitarian communication, but carefully crafted literary performances. A letter might begin with elaborate greetings and expressions of friendship, then discuss philosophical questions or literary topics, include references to shared memories or private jokes, and close with elegant formulaic phrases. These letters would sometimes be treasured and preserved, collected into volumes and even published. Personal journals and diaries provided space for reflection and observation without the formal constraints of poems or essays. An official might keep a journal recording his daily activities, his observations of political events, his personal reactions to successes and failures. These journals were not intended for publication, but after the author's death, family members might preserve them as intimate portraits of a respected ancestor. Later historians sometimes used these private journals as sources, finding in them candid perspectives on events that official histories presented more formally. Women's literature existed in the margins of this male-dominated literary culture. Educated women, usually from wealthy families, as few women received formal education, wrote poetry and essays, though they had fewer opportunities to circulate their work publicly. Some women's poetry survived because male relatives valued and preserved it. A few exceptional women gained recognition during their lifetimes, hosting literary salons or corresponding with male scholars who respected their talent. But much women's writing was lost, destroyed, or simply never preserved because it was not seen as worthy of the care given to men's work. The physical forms of this personal literature varied. Poems might be written on scrolls, on fans, on album leaves that could be bound into small books. Essays were typically written on scrolls that could be unrolled and read at leisure. Letters were folded in specific ways and sealed with wax or cord. All of these required paper, ink, and brushes, and the materials themselves could be chosen to enhance the aesthetic effect. A poem on high-quality paper with gold flecks, written in ink made from the finest pine soot, became a luxury object as well as a literary work. This private literary culture created networks of friendship and intellectual exchange that crossed geographical and temporal boundaries. Scholars separated by hundreds of miles could maintain intimate friendships through correspondence. A poet could feel connected to poets who had lived centuries earlier through the act of studying and imitating their work. The literary tradition became a continuous conversation spanning generations, with each writer contributing their voice while also responding to all the voices that had come before. And all of this required writing, required the continuous production and preservation of manuscripts, required the infrastructure of papermaking, the training of calligraphers, the circulation of texts through networks of friends and students. The empire of paper was not just an empire of official documents and classical learning. It was also an empire of personal expression, of private feeling made permanent through ink and brush, of human connection sustained across distance and time through carefully crafted words on carefully made paper. For all the labor spent preserving texts, loss was constant and devastating. Fire was the greatest enemy. Wooden buildings burned easily, and libraries were particularly vulnerable because of the concentration of flammable material. A single fire could destroy the work of generations in hours. The Great Library of Chang'an burned during political turmoil, taking with it hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Entire categories of ancient literature survive only as fragments or are known only through references in catalogues of lost books. Water was another threat. Floods could destroy buildings and the documents within them. Even without catastrophic flooding, humidity caused problems. In the warm, moist climate of southern China, mold grew quickly on paper and silk, blackening the material and eating away at the fibers. Librarians fought a constant battle against decay, airing out documents periodically, replacing damaged copies, using various treatments to repel insects and mold. Insects were relentless. Silverfish, book lice, termites, all fed on paper and the paste used in bookbinding. Our storage room left unattended for a few years might contain scrolls riddled with holes, the text fragmentary and illegible, where insects had eaten through multiple layers. Some archivists used camphor or other aromatic substances to repel insects, but this was only partially effective. War and political upheaval destroyed more texts than all natural causes combined. When dynasties fell and new ones rose, the transition was often violent. Rebel armies or invading forces might deliberately destroy libraries and archives to erase the cultural memory of the conquered regime. Books were burned as political acts or simply destroyed because soldiers needed fuel for fires or paper for more mundane purposes. The burning of books under the first emperor of Qin became infamous, but similar destructions occurred throughout Chinese history, each one erasing parts of the accumulated knowledge of the past. Even without intentional destruction, the chaos of war disrupted the institutions that preserved texts. Monasteries were abandoned, their libraries left to decay, official archives were neglected as governments collapsed. Families fled their homes, leaving behind private libraries. Scholars died without heirs to preserve their collections. In the aftermath, some texts would be recovered, but many were lost forever. The irony is that we often learn about lost texts from the very documents that survived. Ancient bibliographies list thousands of works that no longer exist. Commentaries quote from texts that have vanished. References in letters or essays mention books that their authors took for granted but which are now utterly lost. We know titles, sometimes even tables of contents, but not the actual words. It is like having a library catalogue with no library. Yet sometimes, against all odds, texts survived in unexpected ways. In the early 20th century, archaeologists exploring the cave temples of Dunhuang in western China made an extraordinary discovery. In a sealed cave that had been walled up around the year 1000 CE, they found tens of thousands of manuscripts, scrolls, and booklets piled from floor to ceiling. The dry desert air had preserved them perfectly. Among these documents were some of the oldest surviving examples of printed texts, rare Buddhist sutras, official documents from long-fallen dynasties, personal letters, medical texts, astronomical charts, a snapshot of medieval Chinese literary culture frozen in time. Other texts survived because they were buried in tombs with their owners. The Chinese practice of including grave goods meant that sometimes books were interred with the dead, sealed in underground chambers where the stable temperature and humidity allowed paper and silk to survive for centuries. When these tombs were excavated, they yielded texts that had been lost from the living tradition, philosophical works or early versions of classics that differed from the received versions, providing scholars with new insights into ancient thought. The recovery of lost texts was a scholarly obsession. When fragmentary copies of rare texts were discovered, scholars would painstakingly work to reconstruct the full text, comparing fragments, consulting references in other works, sometimes using educated guesswork to fill gaps. This reconstruction work was itself a form of literature, and the reconstructed texts, while not identical to the lost originals, preserved at least some portion of what had been lost. But no amount of careful preservation could prevent all loss. The fragility of the materials was fundamental. Paper lasts only so long before it crumbles. Silk rots, ink fades. Every manuscript was temporary, surviving only through the continuous work of copying and recopying. A text that was not copied regularly would eventually disappear as the physical manuscripts containing it degraded beyond readability. This awareness of fragility shaped how scholars thought about their work. They knew that the texts they studied had survived only through the dedicated labor of countless anonymous scribes who had copied them over the centuries. They knew that they had a responsibility to continue this work, to preserve for future generations what had been preserved for them. Every time they copied a text, they were participating in a chain of transmission that stretched back into the distant past and forward into an unknown future. The gaps in our knowledge of ancient Chinese literature are vast. Entire genres of writing have disappeared. Of the poetry written during the Han Dynasty, only a tiny fraction survives. Most personal letters, journals, and essays were lost because they were not seen as worthy of official preservation. Technical works on agriculture, engineering, or military affairs were often not copied because they became obsolete and no one valued them highly enough to preserve them. Standing in a modern library containing ancient Chinese texts, you must imagine all the empty spaces on the shelves, all the books that should be there but are not, all the voices that have been silenced by fire and flood and war and simple neglect. What survives is a fragment, and we are lucky to have even that fragment. The miracle is not that so much was lost, but that anything at all survived. And yet what did survive has shaped Chinese culture and thought for millennia. The classical texts that were preserved through continuous copying became canonical, defining the intellectual tradition. The poetry that survived became models for all later poets. The historical records that endured became the foundation for understanding the past. The selective survival of texts was not random but reflected choices about what mattered, what was worth the labor of preservation. What we have is what generations of scribes and scholars decided was most important to save. This history of loss and survival is also a meditation on the nature of memory and forgetting, on the heroic but ultimately limited human ability to preserve knowledge across time. We can save some things but not everything. We can remember some of the past but not all of it. And so we choose, or rather thousands of individuals across centuries choose, and the cumulative effect of their choices is the inherited tradition, partial and fragmentary but precious beyond measure. As we approach the Tang dynasty in the 9th century, a new technology begins to emerge that will transform the landscape of textual production and preservation. This is woodblock printing, a technique that allows for the multiplication of texts without the need for scribes to copy them character by character. The development of printing is gradual, beginning with small experiments and eventually growing into a full-scale technology that will democratize access to knowledge in ways previously unimaginable. The earliest forms of printing are simple seals. For centuries, Chinese officials had used carved seals to stamp their names or official titles onto documents, creating an impression in red ink that served as authentication. The principle was straightforward. Carve characters in reverse on a hard surface, apply ink, press onto paper, and the image appears in the correct orientation. At some point, someone recognized that this same principle could be applied to entire pages of text. The process of woodblock printing begins with a master copy of the text written in beautiful, clear calligraphy. This manuscript is pasted face down onto a smooth wooden block, typically made from fine-grained pear or jujube wood. The characters show through the back of the paper, and the carver carefully cuts away the wood around each character, leaving the characters raised in relief. This requires extraordinary skill. The carver must work in reverse, and a single mistake can ruin hours of work. Each block produces one page, so a book of any length requires dozens or hundreds of blocks. Once the block is carved, printing is relatively straightforward. The block is inked using a brush or an ink-saturated pad. A sheet of paper is laid carefully on the surface, and gentle pressure is applied, either by hand or using a soft tool, to transfer the ink to the paper. The paper is then peeled away, revealing the printed text. With a single block, a skilled printer can produce hundreds or thousands of identical copies, far more quickly than the fastest scribe could write them. The earliest surviving examples of woodblock printing are Buddhist texts. This makes sense. Buddhism emphasized the accumulation of merit through the multiplication of sacred texts, and printing allowed this multiplication to happen on a scale impossible with hand copying. Buddhist monasteries became early centers of printing technology, using it to produce dharani, short texts containing sacred formulae, and eventually entire sutras. The famous Diamond Sutra, dated to 868 CE and discovered at Dunhuang, is the oldest complete printed book still in existence, a scroll over 16 feet long containing both text and illustrations. Printing brought tremendous advantages. A text carved onto blocks could be preserved indefinitely. The blocks themselves could last for centuries if properly stored, and new printings could be made whenever needed. The risk of copying errors was eliminated, except for errors in the original master copy or mistakes in the carving. The cost per copy decreased dramatically once the initial investment in carving had been made. Texts that had previously been rare and expensive could now be produced in quantities that made them accessible to anyone who could afford a few sheets of printed paper. But printing also involved trade-offs. The initial cost of carving the blocks was high, making it impractical for texts that would have limited readership. The blocks were bulky and required significant storage space. Corrections were difficult. If an error was discovered after carving, the entire block might need to be recarved, or at least patched, which could be visible in the printed copies. And something was lost in the transition from manuscript to print: the individuality of handwritten texts, the sense of connection between reader and the hand that had written the words, the variations that made each manuscript unique. Early printing remained limited in scope. It was used primarily for Buddhist texts, where the religious motivation justified the cost. Some government offices began using woodblocks to print official notices and forms, but most books continued to be produced by hand copying. The infrastructure for large-scale commercial printing did not yet exist, and many scholars preferred manuscript copies for their aesthetic qualities. We stand at a threshold, looking forward to the Song dynasty when printing will explode and transform Chinese literary culture. creating a publishing industry, making books affordable to the middle class, revolutionizing education and the examination system. But in this moment, in the late Tang, printing is still new, still experimental, its full potential not yet realized. The old world of manuscript culture coexists with the emerging world of print, and neither has yet fully displaced the other. Walking through the technology of printing, feeling the carved wooden blocks, smelling the ink made from soot and oil, touching the paper that comes away bearing its impressed characters, we can sense the magnitude of what is changing. For 1,000 years, every text has been a unique object made by human hands. Every character has been written by a scribe whose wrist ached, whose eyes grew tired, who took pride or frustration in the work. The multiplication of knowledge has depended entirely on human labor, on the endless patient copying that preserved the classics, multiplied the sutras, circulated the poetry, maintained the archives. Now for the first time, there is another way. A machine simple, powered by human hands still, but a machine nonetheless can do what previously only scribes could do. The implications are staggering and will take centuries to fully unfold. Knowledge will become cheaper, more accessible, more standardized. The role of memory will change when you can consult a printed book rather than having to memorize everything. Education will transform when students can afford to own books rather than borrowing rare manuscripts. The examination system will evolve when candidates can study from printed editions of the classics. But we are not yet in that world. We stand in the late twilight of manuscript culture, when printing exists but has not yet conquered. The scribes still labor in their quiet halls, brushes moving steadily across paper. The monasteries still maintain their scriptoria. The imperial archives still employ hundreds of copyists. This world of paper and ink and human hands will continue for centuries more, even as printing slowly, gradually, begins to change it. The future will bring both gains and losses. What will be gained is access. What will be gained is access, multiplication, preservation through mechanical reproduction. What will be lost is something harder to define. The intimate human scale of texts, the presence of the writer's hand visible in the brushstrokes, the sense that knowledge is rare and precious and worth infinite labor to preserve. We stand between two worlds, honoring the old even as the new emerges, understanding that all progress involves trade-offs, that every solution creates new problems, that the human relationship with knowledge is always evolving, always contested, never simple or final. Now the journey draws toward its close. We return from the past to the present, from the world of scrolls and inkstones, to our own world of screens and instant access to more information than any library in ancient China could have held. But the ancient world has not entirely vanished. It persists in fragments, in museums, in the texts that survived, in the continuing practice of calligraphy, in the respect for the written word that remains part of Chinese culture. In climate-controlled museum cases, you can still see original manuscripts from the Tang dynasty or earlier. The paper yellowed but still intact, the characters clear across more than 1,000 years. These objects are miraculous, fragile sheets that should have crumbled to dust centuries ago but were preserved through careful stewardship, through lucky storage conditions, through the reverence with which they were treated. To stand before one of these ancient scrolls is to feel time collapse. Those characters were written by a human hand, a person who lived and breathed and thought and felt, who pressed brush to paper with the same muscle and nerve that we use for writing, who hoped their words might endure. In archaeological sites across China, excavations continue to uncover documents buried in tombs or abandoned in desert caves. Each discovery adds to our knowledge, filling in small gaps in the historical record, providing new insights into how people thought and lived. A personal letter from a soldier stationed on the frontier, complaining about the cold and asking his family to send warm clothes. A shopping list from a monastery kitchen. A child's practice calligraphy with corrections from a teacher. These mundane documents, preserved by accident rather than intention, bring the past to life in ways that official histories cannot. In traditional schools and calligraphy studios, the old arts are still practiced. Students still learn to grind ink on stones, to hold the brush correctly, to write characters in the classical styles, seal script, clerical script, regular script, cursive script. The discipline is the same that scholars learned 1,000 years ago: patience, precision, the integration of mind and hand, the respect for the physical act of writing, as something more than mere communication, as an art form with its own history and aesthetics. The lessons of this ancient world of paper and ink are not merely historical. They speak to fundamental questions about knowledge and memory, about how we preserve what matters, about the relationship between the ephemeral and the permanent, about the value of slowness and craft in a world that prizes speed and efficiency. Consider what it meant to copy a text character by character. The scribe could not rush. Each character required attention. This enforced a particular kind of engagement with the text, a slow absorption that is different from rapid reading. The scribe was not just transmitting information, but internalizing it, making it part of themselves through the physical act of writing. In our world of cut and paste, of instant duplication, we have gained efficiency, but perhaps lost this deep engagement. Consider what it meant that books were rare and expensive.
Each one represented hours or days or weeks of human labor.
This scarcity created value, not just economic value, but cultural and psychological value. To own a book was a privilege. To read one was an act that mattered. When knowledge is scarce, we treat it differently than when it is superabundant. We remember more, we think more carefully, we feel more gratitude for access to learning. The democratization of knowledge that printing and now digital technology have enabled is wonderful, but it has also changed our relationship with texts in ways we are still learning to understand. Consider the fragility of the materials and the labor required to preserve them. Nothing lasted without constant care. This created a culture of stewardship, of responsibility to the past and the future. The librarians and archivists and scribes understood themselves as links in a long chain, receiving knowledge from the past and passing it forward to the future. That sense of stewardship, of being custodians rather than merely consumers of knowledge, is something we might benefit from recovering. The empire that ran on paper is gone. The political structures, the social hierarchies, the specific technologies all have passed away. But the ideal that animated that world, the belief that knowledge matters enough to devote immense labor to its preservation, the conviction that texts are worth making beautifully and keeping carefully, the sense that writing is not just a tool but an art and a discipline, these things remain valuable. As you settle into sleep, let your mind hold the image of a scribe in a quiet hall, brush in hand, attention focused on the paper before them, creating characters that are both communication and art. Feel the weight of the bamboo book, the smoothness of silk, the texture of handmade paper. Smell the ink, the old manuscripts, the cedar storage boxes. Hear the soft scratch of brush on paper, the rustle of scrolls, the quiet concentration of people engaged in essential work. This world is distant from us now, separated by centuries and by fundamental changes in technology and culture. Yet it is also intimately present, because the human needs and capacities it expressed, the need to remember, to preserve, to communicate across time, the capacity for patient labor, for attention to beauty, for devotion to ideals beyond immediate utility, these are still with us. We are still the descendants of those scribes, still the heirs of that vast enterprise of preservation that saved fragments of the past for us to inherit. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the empire that ran on paper. Thank you for allowing me to guide you through scriptoriums and archives, examination halls and workshops, through moments of preservation and moments of loss. Our story fades now, but the echoes of this world remain, in museums and libraries, in continuing traditions, and in the simple act of putting careful words onto a surface that might outlast us, that might carry our thoughts into a future we will never see. Sleep well, dream of distant ages, dream of hands that wrote by lamplight, of texts that survived against all odds, of the patient human effort to preserve what matters. Dream of the empire of paper, vast and fragile and infinitely precious, and know that its legacy is still with us. Rest now,